My question then is, all right, the LGBTQ community is very well known. It exists. I'm not going to say accepted, but it's acknowledged. Yet the child-free community, for multiples of the size, are hidden. Any thoughts of why?
That's a really good question. I mean, we could try and speculate. I mean, one possibility is that nobody's been asking about whether people are child surveys. There's a handful of surveys that sometimes in a roundabout way, maybe you can eke out whether people are child free. But for the most part, those questions just aren't on there. And so we didn't know. And we sort of, everybody assumed it was a relatively uncommon, pretty rare group. It's only recently that we've realized, wow, there's an enormous amount of people here. Another possibility is that it's not a very cohesive group because the thing they have in common is not having something. And it's easier to get people banding together on an issue if they have something in common because they do something or because they want something. But the absence of doing something, the absence of wanting something doesn't have that sort of power of bringing people together as much as if it had been the other way around. And so it could just be that there's a huge number of child-free people and they're all doing their own thing because the only thing that unites them is not doing something.
But I also wonder if as it gains more attention in the media, and especially I think within the last 10 years, I've heard more conversations about child-free people than I had in the rest of my life, right? So I think like as it becomes more recognized, it is becoming more of a social identity. So I wonder if we'll see a little bit of a shift as more people start to identify as being child-free.
Welcome to the Child-Free Wealth Podcast, hosted by Bree and Dr. J, Certified Financial Planner. Here we discuss life and finances as it relates to being child-free. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Please consult your advisor before implementing any ideas heard on this podcast.
Hey, Child-Free Wealth listeners. Today I get to nerd out, okay? And I'm warning you right now, if you don't like nerds and research, just skip this episode. I say that because my wife and I were both PhDs. I'm now getting to talk to another set of PhDs, and we're going to talk about child-free and research and all that, and it's going to get nerdy. I'm just warning you. That's not a bad thing. It's just what happens when you put a whole bunch of PhDs in a room. We'll naturally go deep into research and fun stuff. So today on the podcast, we have the Doctors Neal. And by the way, if you've ever wondered, there actually is a plural for doctors. You know, it's not Mr. and Mrs., it's doctors. My wife drives her crazy when something gets sent to us as Mr. and Mrs. So Doctors Neal, Jenna, and Zach. And you've heard me talk about their research before because I've quoted this research they're doing out of Michigan and the numbers of child-free folks and all that before. It's not going to be a surprise. They both professors of psychology at Michigan State University. We got to get the right Michigan. And my wife is from OSU, so we can't fight the Ohio or Michigan battles, but we'll get there. But great to have you on the podcast. How are you two doing?
It's great to be here, Jay. I'm really excited to join you.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here and always a fan of people who are Ohio State fans as well, and being from MSU.
Yeah, there's always the old school rivalries, we'll say. So Jenna and Zach have been working on child-free and the research around it. And I want to start with just asking the simple question. Is child-free one word, two words, got a dash in it? What's the correct way to use child-free? Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm biased. Just trademark the term child-free wealth, and it's one word. So if you say it's not that, I got to change my trademark.
We typically use one word as well, just child-free, no dashes.
Well, but the AP Style Guide says that's wrong.
This is true. To be honest, I'd be happy if people started using child-free with or without a hyphen, with or without a space, if they gave up on using childless as the overarching term for anybody who doesn't have children. One of the things we're trying to get across in some of this work is introducing the word child-free as not a value-laden term, not part of a movement, just a descriptive label. People who don't have kids and don't want kids, if they want to use a hyphen, great. If they don't want to use a hyphen, probably okay too. But the more we see this term come into use as the label that describes this group of people, that would be great.
Yeah, and it's a lot less of a mouthful than voluntarily childless.
Yeah, and I actually saw that in one of your articles that were talking about the history of it. It's interesting. We'll come back to that. And I when I started my company, I did a lot of work with Katie Seppi, who works in more of the childless community. We worked on the terms heavily. In my world, because I'm working finances, I say your financial plan changes when you don't have kids and aren't planning on kids. But don't have kids, not planning on kids' wealth just doesn't work. We have to use a term. And the discussion we ended up with was using the terms child free and permanently childless. And the reason we did that was because you can be childless still. The census still says childless, and you can have adopted kids and different things. And so you mentioned child free or childless. How do you separate those two?
When we distinguish it, we distinguish child-free people as people who don't have kids and never want kids. And when we mean kids in our work, we include both biological and non-biological children. So they don't want to have biological children of their own, but they also don't want to adopt children. They don't want to foster children. They don't want to marry people who have children and become step-parents. They don't want to be involved in having or raising children. So that would be child-free. A childless person is a person who doesn't have kids, but they would have liked to have kids. We have still a third category of people who don't have kids and plan to have kids in the future. We call them not yet parents.
Yeah, and we even have other categories that we've looked at in our research, folks who are undecided. So they're sort of on the fence about whether they want to have kids or not. There's a lot of different types of people out there when it comes to family statuses.
For the people listening, if this sounds like just an academic argument, it's actually a huge discussion. If you listen to my episode about FinCon, I got in a fight with some researchers who asked the question of, do you have dependents or not? And said it's the same as if you're child free or not. I'm like, no, like not even close. When I had that fight, didn't have your article in my hand of like how to ask questions around research around child free and how to use terms. So can you walk me through like the framework you set up there? Because it really is important to identify who we are and like get a good checkbox that then allows us to then do other analysis.
Yeah, so one of the most recent pieces of work we've been working is try and, like you said, this is a tricky sort of topic to navigate, and there's a lot of confusion, a lot of different terms. And so we tried to develop a relatively simple framework to figure out where all these different categories fit in. The sort of top level, the easiest thing we can think about is the first question you'd need to ask someone is, do you have children? It's pretty easy to figure out. It's very easy for people to answer that question. If they answer don't know to that question, and sometimes they do in these surveys, that's a whole other situation if they don't know if they have children. So usually it's a yes/no question. If they answer yes, we call them parents. Pretty straightforward. We can get into sort of finer grained different varieties of parents, but an answer to the yes, I have children makes you a parent. If you say no, then it's where it gets complicated because there are lots and lots of varieties of non-parents. And what we've found in our work is it's just too diverse a group to say parents versus non-parents. There's so much diversity in the non-parent group. When we're looking at the non-parent group, there's two more things that we have to know about. One is what we call circumstances. Are there barriers to you having children? Barriers could be fertility issues, but it could be economic issues. I'd like to have children, but I can't afford them right now. It could be trouble finding a suitable partner, all kinds of life and biological circumstances. And then the third question, and this is the one that almost never gets asked on big sort of surveys, is the attitude, do you want children? And those three all come together to fit into what we think of as child-free. So a child-free person obviously doesn't already have children, and they don't want children. But at least as we understand child-free, it's completely irrelevant if there had been any circumstance issues. So you can be child-free even if you're infertile. Because if you don't want children, it doesn't really matter if you could have had them or not. That question just isn't really relevant.
Well, it may not be relevant in the research, but I'm going to challenge you there because I got in a fight with this. I get in frequent fights if you haven't figured that out. When I'm going to talk about child-free stuff in the financial world. And the question somebody in finance world said, well, I should understand how they got there because it's going to change things. And I go, not really. Now, I'm working with financial therapists, and financial therapists, maybe actually there might be a grieving process with childless. So there is like some need for that. But I'm kind of following you and saying, hey, in the research, like we got to categorize people. I will say what I'm going to push back on is like trying to be more inclusive and saying the terms child-free and childless, people self-select. And does using the term child-free, I don't know, disengage people who want to use the childless term or see that for themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't really studied how people choose what term they use for themselves. Some people may be child free according to how we define the term, but they prefer to use the label childless, or they prefer to use the label voluntarily child, or maybe they prefer no label at all. That becomes a really complicated issue, how people would describe their own situation. But like you said, for the sake of research, we come up with a set of labels that we sort of define in a certain way so that we have a way of talking about these folks. But yeah, you're absolutely right. People may choose different labels for themselves.
Yeah, and there are actually a couple of surveys out there, I think mostly not in the US, where they've asked directly to try to identify child-free people, just ask if they identify as child-free. And I think our prevalence rates that we get from our 3 questions that we ask would probably be lower if we asked directly if people were child-free, because I think a lot of people that would kind of qualify based on our kind of definition, based on circumstance, attitude, and behavior, might not necessarily identify with that label.
It's funny. I was talking with our chief marketing officer, and one of the challenges we have is people don't know to Google, I don't have kids, and how does that impact my wealth? They don't know to Google child free and wealth, or like it's just like. And I had somebody, I did an article, and they said, I didn't know that term was me, but that's me, and that's my life. I was like, okay. And the best I heard, so this once again comes back from what Katie's doing. Her argument is we should just have a different word that doesn't include the word kids in there, essentially. Like we should have an identity that is not about having or not having kids. And I was like, ooh, that's good, but I have no clue where to go with that. So I'm just going to throw that in your lap and say maybe that should be some future research. Well, uh, maybe it doesn't fit, but all right. So in the preamble for this, I asked people for the interviews anything you want me to talk about or don't. And you said, well, we don't talk about us and we don't use the term child free for us as a couple for reasons. Can you talk about your reasons?
Well, when we talk to people about this work, and this is a relatively newer line of work for the two of us. We've been, researching the child-free population for about 4 years now. But it's a hot topic. People like talking to us about it. They like getting engaged. And every now and then they'll ask us, are you child-free? And we tend not to answer that question because we're trying to keep the research focused on the child-free population that we're studying. It's not about us. We're certainly not trying to encourage people to be child-free or to become parents. We really have no stake in whether someone wants kids, has kids. We think people should be able to make those sorts of decisions for themselves. We tend to avoid answering those sorts of questions about our own personal choices because that's not really what we want the research and the focus to be on.
Yeah, we really want to put the research front and center and not have the attention be focused on us as the researchers. We've kind of pushed back on that question a little bit.
I don't blame you. I have more people praying for my soul than I know what to do with. And like it goes down paths. I'm in the South and you say you're child free in the South. It comes with some stigma. And I know you've looked at some of these questions on, warmness and connection and all that. And I wonder, frankly, is it an issue that we can't even publicly say, hey, we're child free without skewing the conversation? And I've had this. I've done press and they're like, go down a path now because I've said I'm child free. I had somebody, I went to buy software for my company and I'm buying something from them. They said, who do you serve? I said, I serve child free people. They said, oh, you hate kids. And I'm like, what in the world? Like, where does that come from? But that's just that reaction. Tell me kind of like, what's the research say about like, are we child free like pariahs or how's this work?
Yeah, and our research, so there's a lot of really great qualitative research out there that other researchers have done that have really shown that child-free people are oftentimes sort of overtly stigmatized for being child-free and experience things like discrimination. In our studies, we've looked at sort of more subtle things like interpersonal warmth, looked at people's sort of warmth ratings towards child-free individuals and parents, and we found that parents and other types of non-parents felt substantially less warm towards child-free individuals than they felt towards each other or towards other parents. And additionally, parents tend to feel very, very warm towards other parents. So they have a very strong preference towards other parents. And so even if they're not being sort of overtly discriminatory, that could mean that child-free people might just kind of get left out because parents tend to gravitate towards other parents. There's sort of both the overt discrimination that other people have talked about, but also the sort of more insidious kind of preference issue that might lead child-free people to get left out socially.
In my words, so I'm going to go the inverse and say they're cold towards us. If you're going to go down the warmth side, I mean, and it's not always the case. And you're doing a lot of work out of Michigan, and I would really wonder state by state. Being in the deep South, especially in a post-Roe world, it's gotten interesting, and it's actually gotten dangerous in some cases. Being cold could literally mean like being ostracized and a few of those other things. And then I've said that to people, and they're like, they'll be in California, and they're like, where? Like, I don't see that. Like, I'm like, different worlds. And I don't know what to do with that data. So, okay, cool. We found out they're more warm towards each other, towards parents. So what does that mean?
We've been thinking about that a lot. We think that one of the things it means is that when, say, institutions are run primarily by parents, parents are the largest group in our population, they may not necessarily have negative feelings towards child-free people. And in fact, our data suggests they don't have overtly negative feelings towards child-free people, but their feelings are so much warmer toward other parents. And this is something we see in all kinds of things. We like people who are similar to ourselves more than we like other people. That effect is so strong for parents that it may feel like child-free people are being excluded or ostracized, when in fact, all that's really happening is parents can identify more with other parents. They have more in common to the extent that they're setting the agenda for, schools, the way towns are built, really sort of anything. They may take the perspective of a parent or of children and prioritize those needs over other needs, not because they dislike child-free people, but because they sort of get where parents are coming from much more readily and feel sort of more in tune with that.
I'm wondering if that makes it. I've been working on this argument for my company, and one of the arguments I'm making is, hey, there's a value of having child-free people provide services to other child-free people because they understand them. They get the warmth that comes with that. I've actually tracked the number of my initial consultation meetings, how many times people end up in tears because it's just like the first time they felt heard and other things. So if I followed your data out, if it comes to like, hey, I want to find there's actually a group right now of working on, hey, I'm a therapist for child-free or childless folks. If I want to find somebody that understands me, connects with me, that might actually be a great selection criteria, essentially, of saying, hey, finding somebody that understands you is going to be more warm to you.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, you'd at least have a reason to expect that you're sort of going into something on the same page, at least with some piece of your life situations. Probably no guarantee that they're going to agree with you, but it gives you that extra piece of commonality that probably gives you a bit of a leg up.
I'm going to go into numbers in a second, but you're opening a can of worms with a lot of these questions. Let's just be honest of this. Like, we're asking questions. I consider the child-free population an underserved, underrepresented population. Kind of joke line, but it's true. I'm like, hey, I'm a cis hetero white male who's a minority, because that's kind of because you check in that box. And like, it is a little, let's call it dangerous, a little edgy to be in this research area. Why did you two take that chance?
Well, we were really interested in this topic partly because we saw sort of a gap in the research, really. There were some great qualitative studies out there of child-free experiences, but far fewer quantitative studies that had large representative samples. And the quantitative studies we did see typically lumped child-free adults in with all other types of non-parents that we've already talked about. So people who were planning to have kids in the future, people who were childless and can't have kids but really wanted them. And so there was just a huge need for somebody to start looking at this literature and really trying to identify child-free people and also look at the prevalence of child-free people. I think even though child-free people are in the minority, our data sort of suggests that they're a pretty big minority. So being able to show that, gosh, even though there's not as many child-free people out there as parents, there's a pretty big group of child-free people out there that are underserved.
And we're going to come to the numbers in a second, because I'm going to ask you 14 questions on that. But I'm just having these nightmares of my PhD committee going over and over and over saying a gap in the research is not a reason to do research. There might be a question that's not answered, and it's not answered for a reason. And when I started my company, I kind of did the same thing. I was like, nobody's serving child-free folks from a financial standpoint. I'm going to go into this, but I might be going into an area that isn't served for a reason. So how do you Like you're going into the unknown and saying, let me poke at this. Did your department all laugh at you for doing this? Or I mean, what's the reception of it?
The reception's been pretty variable. I mean, I suppose when we first started doing this, it wasn't specifically to sort of dive headstrong into researching the child free. We saw that the demographic literature, and most of the time when you get these big demographic surveys, you decide a segment of the population to serve. You've got parents and you've got non-parents. And we started to realize doing research on a group of people called non-parents just makes no sense at all. Because there's like doing research on parents, okay, they have something in common. They've all got kids, and there's stuff you have to do when you have kids. But lumping all the non-parents into one category, like the only thing they have in common is that they don't have kids. But that's not a thing to have in common. There's a lot of different kinds of non-parents. Our work has tended to focus on the child-free group of non-parents, but really more broadly, we're trying to blow out that group to highlight there's lots of different kinds of non-parents. They're different. They, require asking different kinds of survey questions. They have different life needs. We've been focusing on the child free because among the non-parents, it's the biggest group. There's a huge number of them, and there was nobody writing about it. And so we thought it was really an interesting group. But like you said, it gets mixed reactions. Sort of traditional demography has been slower to catch on to this. They do parents versus non-parents. Sometimes they'll talk about childless people as an umbrella category. But when we share this work sort of more generally, it's not common that we'll get an email from a child-free person that says, I thought I was the only person like this, and I read your research and find out there's millions of us. I feel validated, or I feel seen, thanks for doing this work. And so it really depends on who's seeing it, the kind of reaction we get.
And I'm with you. Whenever people ask me why I ended up in this area, I jokingly say, but it's true. I was researching to see how weird my wife and I are. Now, by the way, we're two PhDs who are child free. We're weird by nature. Okay, we sit around the dinner table talking about research studies. You two actually do them together. Okay, like you guys got us beat. But like we're trying to figure out how weird we are, and I found out like there's lots of us out there. We're weird for other reasons, but like we're normal within the subset of child free folks. And I've been working through this, and I do a bunch of press, and people will ask me, okay, well, what percentage of the US is child free? The best data I have is yours, but I struggle on how to say it to somebody in general because, like, whether or not Michigan is representative and blah, blah, blah. You are on some big morning show and they ask you what percentage of the US is child free. What answer do you give?
What we would typically say is that in our research, we have found that about 1 in 5 people are child-free in Michigan. Our study just focused on adults in Michigan, so we don't necessarily know whether that would generalize to the US population. However, Michigan's population is very similar to the US population in terms of all kinds of demographic characteristics, so in terms of age, race, education, income, and politics. So we do think our findings might apply more broadly. We don't know for certain, but we think it might apply more broadly.
And if I'm following the data right, it looks like that number's up after Dobbs.
It is. We saw a jump from about 1 in 5 to 26% immediately post Dobbs. And we're not certain with the passage of Prop 3 here whether we would have seen a drop back down after that once reproductive rights were enshrined in the state constitution here in Michigan, or whether that was something that was a more permanent jump.
Yeah, and when I'm talking about your research, because of the people I'm talking financial people about people who don't have kids, I tend to lump in child-free and childless from your original research and kind of going, it's 25%-ish, and kind of go 1 in 4-ish. And they usually push back. And the first thing they'll give me is, that's what they said today. They're changing their minds. And I will go, no, first of all, my research, other research says, I got people sterilizing at 21. If you look at post-Dobbs, the number of people that got sterilized, it went through the roof. I mean, it's just an insane increase. What do you say to the people who say, hey, well, they'll change their minds? Let's just tackle that one.
Yeah, well, in our studies, we have at least a couple of studies where we looked at this retrospectively. We weren't able to track it over time, but we did ask people when they made the decision to be child-free, and the most common answer was in their 20s. This is very young. And these are people who are currently in their 40s on average. And so at least people are reporting that they're deciding quite young and not changing their minds. So we don't have any evidence of people kind of shifting from identifying as child free to later on becoming parents down the road.
I'm with you. And I think every other study I've read has said essentially the same thing. It's just that assumption that, well, they're young kids, they don't know what they're doing. Things will change. And my argument is, yeah, it's going to change. And actually more people are saying they're going to be child free. Have you seen much in the data on like the younger generations, the percentage of child free versus the older generations?
We've often thought, we sort of our hypothesis, and everybody expects, younger people are going to be more likely to identify as child free than older folks. And we actually haven't seen that sort of difference. And it actually makes us wonder if it's maybe not so much an age thing as it's becoming more acceptable to identify as child free now. That there were always child free people out there. There were always a lot of child free people out there. But 20, 30 years ago, they were more reluctant to say so. And now we're able to see them. So the folks that are in their 50s and 60s that are child free may not have been comfortable saying so in a survey 30 years ago. Now we can see it. And so it could be that we're just getting a more faithful depiction of how many child free people there are out there. And there's not a huge age difference.
So, but we are seeing other data, fertility rates going down in the younger generations. If we follow that path, and those are all average numbers that I hate. Like they're lumping together, way too many groups. I just feel like there's a reasonable assumption, and just from the attitudes and beliefs in what you're seeing from people, that the Gen Y, Gen Z are more and more like, hey, I can't afford to have a kid. Or we did research on why people choose to be child free or not. They're like, hey, I don't want to pass down my medical issues, the environment, the politics. All these reasons. I struggle if you're gonna try to, if we're gonna say it's, we're just getting a better reading on it, and the total percentage is not growing. I'm going, I don't know that I believe that, but you got the better research. So where am I off in my assumptions?
Well, you're probably right. It continues to be our hypothesis that younger people are more likely to be child free. I think part of the challenge is that the difference may not be huge yet. And so it's difficult to detect statistically. It might be a while before it's a big enough difference that we can really see that. The other challenge is, frequently when we talk about this work, somebody will ask us, well, what about birth rate statistics? And there's a bunch of differences between birth rate statistics, which get talked about a lot, and the sort of thing we're doing. So one difference is birth rate stats are about whether people have kids or don't have kids. We mostly aren't interested in that. We're interested in what people want. Do people want kids or not want kids, which is not a behavior or a biological thing, it's an attitude. And so that's one thing that makes our research a bit different from birth rates and a little trickier to study. It requires asking different sorts of questions. But the other thing that makes it difficult to compare our findings with birth rate stats is we could see birth rate stats, fertility rates come down by people having fewer kids, even if they don't have 0 kids. It's a little difficult to line up declines in fertility with increases in the number of child-free people. They're definitely going to be related, but it's not going to be a one-to-one connection.
The fight I was getting into with researchers doing financial research on using the term child-free is they argued that they're asking a question about current state. Do you have dependents or not? And they're saying child-free is a future state. Do you plan on having kids? And I went, my brain's hurting. I don't agree. I don't. How would you address? Give me some words to address that with. I'm over here working with the financial, because what I ultimately want, and by the way, you two should do, is actual stats about net worth and income and all that based on child free versus not, which don't exist because we're not asking the question right. But this future state versus current state and whether or not child free gets that. How do we get there?
Yeah, I don't really think that child free is a future state, because that would suggest that they're planning to do something. But these are people who have said, I don't want to have kids ever, right? So they're sort of in a final state of decision making, unless you are of the mindset that you think people are going to change their minds, which we already talked about, which doesn't necessarily happen. It is pretty much a state that is current for people. not future. Now, not yet parents, I would say people who are planning to have kids in the future, that's a future state. And I still think that would be interesting from a financial standpoint for people to understand if people are planning to have kids. So I don't understand why they wouldn't be interested in future states anyway, but I really don't think that child free would be a future state.
By the way, if your ears were ringing, I literally was quoting your research. I'm like, listen, they're like, well, we don't have enough data to know that it's a big enough group that we should segment out. And I'm like, well, you ask about gender, you ask about all different types of things. And I'm going, your gender question has changed over time to be more of a continuum. It's just not a binary, not just a male female. Well, the child question should be a continuum also. And that was just my words of it. But I'm like, hey, it's a big group. And the thing I ended up saying to them, and I apologize if I was too estimating your overestimating your stuff, but I'm like, look, in the same study in Michigan, I think it was like 7.9% was LGBTQ plus. The child-free populations is almost triple the size. And they were like, well, I don't believe that. And I'm like, okay. I mean, my question to that is, all right, the LGBTQ community is very well known. It exists. I'm not gonna say accepted, but it's acknowledged. Yet the child-free community, for multiples of the size, are hidden. Any thoughts of why?
That's a really good question. I mean, we could try and speculate. I mean, one possibility is that nobody's been asking about whether people are child free in surveys. There's a handful of surveys that sometimes in a roundabout way, maybe you can eke out whether people are child free. But for the most part, those questions just aren't on there. And so we didn't know. And we sort of, everybody assumed it was a relatively uncommon, pretty rare group. It's only recently that we've realized, wow, there's an enormous amount of people here. Another possibility is that it's not a very cohesive group because the thing they have in common is not having something. And it's easier to get people banding together on an issue if they have something in common because they do something or because they want something. But the absence of doing something, the absence of wanting something doesn't have that sort of power of bringing people together as much as if it had been the other way around. And so it could just be that there's a huge number of child-free people and they're all doing their own thing because the only thing that unites them is not doing something, which is sort of.
But I also wonder if as it gains more attention in the media, and especially I think within the last 10 years, I've heard more conversations about child-free people than I had in the rest of my life, right? So I think like as it becomes more recognized, it is becoming more of a social identity. So I wonder if we'll see a little bit of a shift as more people start to identify as being child-free.
Well, and I think the terms we use matter. This week, it seems to be dinks are the popular one on social media. And I draw a line between dinks and dinkies, no kids yet versus never. And like, yeah. And I'm trying to talk to, different press and different thing. And I'm like, trying to explain the difference and they get lost. They're kind of like, yeah, whatever. And you have to give it at some point. And I don't know. I mean, I think you're doing the right thing. So where are you going with this research next? Like, I don't want to like scoop you, but like, so you've asked percentages in Michigan. We've looked at pre-post DOBS. We've looked at how to define it. Where do we go?
We're interested in a couple different directions. I mean, we've looked at DOBS, but this issue of reproductive rights, reproductive health, this is something we think is going to keep evolving. And so we'd like to keep an eye on that because we don't really, when we started the study about the pre-post DOBS, we didn't know that Roe was going to be overturned. We didn't know about the DOBS decision. That just sort of happened. And so we had a chance to look at it. And so by the same token, we have no idea what's going to happen in November. Something's going to happen, and we think it's going to have some implications. So we're keeping an eye on that. But we're also trying to move this work outside of just Michigan and outside of just the United States, because we're curious if there's this many child-free people in Michigan, there might be a lot of people around the world. We've started looking at it in places like Japan. So Japan, we all know that they've had a sort of fertility population crisis there for a long time. That means that they collect really, really good demographic data, way better than we get in the United States. So we can get a much more detailed portrait about what's going on there. We're also interested in how this is playing out in the developing world, where fertility issues and fertility control and autonomy are much more complicated. And so we're interested in is this child-free population emerging in those places too? So we're really trying to push this outside of just Michigan where we got started.
And I had seen, and I think it was you, Zach, kind of a informal AMA after this was posted on Reddit. You mentioned that your funding was really just kind of like a starter grant from the department or something like that. And somebody asked, well, can we send money to your grant? And I'm like, yeah, let's do a Kickstarter to like move this research. I'm not sure. Can we do a Kickstarter of grant research? I'm like, I'm all for it, but like, can we as a child-free community actually help you do stuff? Or what do you got any ideas there?
Yeah, so this is something we're looking into right now. We work for a nonprofit, Michigan State University. In principle, we should be able to receive donations to help support this work because, as you've mentioned a couple times, this is not the most popular topic. It's not something that people like hearing about. It's difficult to get funding. And so we're trying to explore sort of alternate angles, non-traditional angles for research funding. We're definitely looking at that, but we also just love hearing from child-free people. And so anything that we maybe haven't thought of that we should be asking about this population, things that the population, the community wants to know about itself, we are always open to new ideas.
Well, when you come up with the donation, the GoFundMe, the Kickstarter, the something for research, you let me know. We'll be sure to share it. Because I think we need to. I think we need to do that. And if you two want to do the work, well, then the rest of us can pony up money so we can just get the research. I don't know. We'll have to figure out the politics of a university. If those who haven't been in a university, it sounds like real simple to do something like that. It is a giant nightmare because there's a grants office that has not had a new thought in the past 100 years. And I don't know your grants office, but I'm sure it is the same as every university I've ever been at. So where can they follow you, like catch up on the research, reach out to you?
So we both have personal websites that have dedicated pages for this child-free work, and we keep those updated. It's important for us because we're studying this community. All of our research papers are always free to download. You're never going to hit a paywall. Never, to any of your listeners, if they're interested in research, never pay a publisher's fee to download a research article. Never do that. Send an email to the researcher or Google it. They will be happy to send it to you for free. And so we keep everything online for folks to find it.
Jenna?
Yeah, it'll either be in a preprint form or we also try to publish open access whenever we possibly can for that reason, so that folks can access our work.
Yeah, I literally found their website. There was some of the work on Dobbs. I'm like, can I talk about this yet? I mean, where is it?
And we're very excited that paper just came out last week. And so we're excited to get the word out about how these decisions are affecting people.
Yeah, and just for context, we're recording in January, this will air after, but it's just been one of those discussions and it's awesome. So thank you very much for being here. Next time you have something fun, you're going to have to reach out because we're going to have to dive into the next research area. And by the way, when you get the GoFundMe or something, we're going to include that link. So, we can, I don't know if we have a lot of money, but at least we can find some people to start sending you something.
That sounds great, Jay. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Follow Childfree Wealth on social media or email us at podcast@childfreewealth.com. If you're interested in working together, book a free consultation call by visiting our website, childfreewealth.com. We'll see you next week.